Who knows what could happen while you're traveling on a route to another city? For Red, it leads to him encountering a strange and troublesome Squirtle. XXX. It had been well over a month since the incident at school. A month since I refused to leave my room, and my mother, also worried about what I could do, let me get away with that. After that incident, most people would walk by our house in a hurry. Those who didn't were usually parents who came to shout at my mother and demand that we move away from us nice normal folks, as they called themselves, and at one point, a fair number of bricks and rocks had been thrown through the windows of our home. We were effectively pariahs to everyone but Blue's family because of my abnormality. And I could do nothing but cry and tell my mother how sorry I was for causing all of this. It was around that low point in our lives, when Mom was seriously contemplating moving from Pallet Town to Cinnabar Island down in the south, that a stranger appeared on our doorstep. He called himself Mr. Psychic. Not his real name, but a moniker he'd picked up in his life. He said he was a friend of Professor Oak's who was asked to help. Despite his mentioning the professor's name, the first time I met that man, I was afraid. Ordinarily, I would always be quiet when meeting unfamiliar people. My mother said I was shy, while Blue called me socially retarded. However, my fear of meeting with that man had nothing to do with shyness or poor people skills. It was fear of what he might do to me, or what I might do to him. No need to be so quiet, my boy, Mr. Psychic said as he sat across from me at the dinner table in the living room. I can't decide how I'm going to help you if you don't tell me what happened yourself. I didn't want to talk about it, especially since his help didn't involve getting rid of this power of mine. Mom was in the kitchen, trying to respect our guest's privacy, but still worried enough to occasionally appear in the entrance and stare out at me to make sure I was okay. She'd been looking out when Mr. Psychic spoke, so when our eyes met, she mouthed something like, "Go on. Talk to him," before returning to dinner. So, against my desires, I told him what had happened that day. He told me that I had some sort of empathetic telepathy, that I could transfer my feelings to the minds of others in the form of thoughts, and thoughts centered on negative feelings like pain, anger, and sadness harmed those who received them. That was why what happened that day happened. The headache I felt was my telepathy as it connected to the minds of those nearby, forcing my pain onto them until it hurt them so much, they fell unconscious. Mr. Psychic said, for many people with psychic abilities, it is important to master control of their emotions and thoughts. Otherwise, they might wind up harming many people, or worse, lose themselves in their own minds. So if you don't want to harm people or yourselves with your emotions, the first step is to control them. And so, I trained. I worked with Mr. Psychic until I was able to reach a point where I could assume I had full control over my emotions. Of course, maybe I learned how to do that too well. I'm just saying that, before, he was only shy and very quiet. Now I can barely tell what he's thinking, I heard Mom tell Mr. Psychic after our very last session. I'm happy that he can at least go back to school with little worry, but he's so different now. Is that normal? Is that how he's going to be from now on? Mr. Psychic chuckled. It's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Ketchum. If your son is trying to make himself a blank slate, it's out of fear of harming people again. So, you see, he's still quite an emotional human being. It will just take a while before he feels comfortable enough to think that he has full control of himself. Will he really? There are many psychics who've expressed fear over what they're capable of, including myself. But to overcome that fear is something we must all do on our own. Do you understand, Red? I flinched from my hiding place at the top of the stairs as Mr. Psychic continued, we'll meet again someday in Saffron City. And then he was gone. I felt sad about him leaving, even though we only knew each other for a few days. I couldn't really express it, though, for fear of what would happen. Chapter 7. On the way to Vermilion City. I had been quickly making my way down Route 5 from Cerulean City. Upon reaching the end, I was torn between taking the quick underground path or the long way through Saffron City. That was because I remembered what Mr. Psychic had told me about meeting him again in Saffron. Maybe he lived here somewhere. Maybe he was even the gym leader of the Saffron Gym, whose specialty I knew was Psychic-type Pokémon. That would be a surprising way to meet up with him again. The sight sensation of something scratching against my leg made me snap out of my thoughts. Pikachu was looking up at me, seeming slightly annoyed and impatient. At that point, I made up my mind. Saffron's the largest city in Kanto, so it'll probably be full of crowds of people and traffic that'll slow us down. It'd be faster to just take the underground path to Route 6. I said that, but I really did want to look through the city, if only to find Mr. Psychic. However, it was just too big to go around wandering aimlessly. I couldn't do that when I had such a tight schedule already to make it to the SS. And we entered the small building to the east of the entrance leading into Saffron City. A few people were sitting on benches, sweating and panting as if the walk through the tunnel was difficult. We approached the stairs leading down to the underground path and just stood there, looking down into the darkness. Our last trek through a dark place ended miserably, and though this place had no wild Pokémon lurking about, there had to have been some rough and shady characters down there ready to threaten me for my money and Pokémon, just like on television. Excuse me, Sonny, I nearly fell forward down the stairs at the sudden sound of an old lady's voice. I quickly recovered and stepped aside, allowing her to pass. If a little old lady was confident enough about entering such a place, I could be, too. So I went down as well, eventually, after being pushed from behind by Pikachu and recovering in time to avoid getting a cracked head. Our walk through the underground path, while long, was uneventful. The only things we found down there were unused items that appeared to have been dropped, all of which I eagerly picked up in order to save some money, but the suspicious antidote needles. I'm lucky Blue wasn't there to see me do it, because it'd just be another thing to add to the list of things he'd tease me about. Upon entering Route 6, I took a deep breath of fresh air and was ready to head to Vermilion City with no distractions. Hey, you! A young voice stopped me from moving before I could even begin. It belonged to a young Boy Scout who eagerly ran up to me, all dressed in green. You look like a trainer. Wanna have a Pokémon battle? I should have been hurrying, but instead, I wound up saying, sure. One quick battle wouldn't hurt. I could always run to reach Vermilion, anyway. I'm Red. I'm Ricky. Prepare to fall victim to my awesome Pokémon. Minutes later, we stood in the middle of the dirt road, several feet away from each other. The camper boy named Ricky was the first to send out a Pokémon. Go! Weepinbell. In a flash of light, a Weepinbell appeared, widening its large, open mouth as it flailed the big leaves attached to its yellow, bell-shaped body. They were deceptive Pokémon because, despite their dopey and harmless-seeming appearance, they were known to devour anything nearby them when hungry and melt prey with their body acid, and cut up those too big to fit into their mouths with their razor-sharp leaves. I felt Pikachu needed a bit of a break after all he did in the gym battle with Misty, and sending out Horsey to face this thing was a no-go. So I decided to go with Bulbasaur, and maybe boost his confidence after losing his first gym battle. Go! Bulbasaur! In a flash of light, Bulbasaur appeared with a cry and began to stare down the Weepinbell. Cool, you have a Bulbasaur. But my Weepinbell can totally take it down despite the type resistance. Weepinbell, use sleep powder. Ricky's Weepinbell breathed out a cloud of green dust that swept over Bulbasaur. In seconds, Bulbasaur had fallen to the ground, fast asleep. Wake up, Bulbasaur! I called out, hoping to wake it up before the Weepinbell could attack, but he still slept. At that point, Pikachu began to shout and shake a paw angrily at the sleeping grass type. Alright, Weepinbell, jump in and use cut. The Weepinbell jumped forward, and when it came close, slashed at Bulbasaur with its leaves. The impact made Bulbasaur tumble backwards, but it also woke it up. It's up. Weepinbell. Use sleep powder again. Close its mouth with your vines. I commanded. Bulbasaur's vines came out from under his bulb, shot towards the Weepinbell before it could breathe out its sleep-inducing dust, and wrapped around its mouth to close it shut. Now hit it with acid. Weepinbell. Use razor leaf. As Bulbasaur fired a spray of purple acid from his bulb at the Weepinbell, it flailed its leaves and fired a barrage of smaller leaves at Bulbasaur. Use your vines to knock away the leaves. Bulbasaur quickly pulled back his vines, knocking aside the razor-sharp leaves on their way back to his bulb. Only 2 managed to hit him, but they didn't seem to do much damage. At the same time, Ricky's Weepinbell was hit by the acid while it was coughing up the sleep powder it failed to exhale. Now tackle it. With a cry, Bulbasaur ran forward and charged into the Weepinbell's face, hitting it with enough force to send it tumbling back into its trainer. The Weepinbell gave a gasping cry before deflating a bit, having been knocked unconscious. You did your best, buddy, Ricky spoke regretfully before returning the grass type to its ball. He then took out another one. It's your turn, Squirtle. I couldn't help but be surprised. Squirtle. In a flash of light, a Squirtle appeared, or rather, it appeared while withdrawn inside of its shell. Similar to how Bulbasaur and Charmander didn't look like the pictures used for their species in the Pokédex, this Squirtle didn't really look like the Squirtle in the Pokédex, or at least, its shell didn't. A Squirtle shell should have been a shade of brown, but this one's was a shade of gray with little bumps just barely visible on it. I couldn't tell if there was any difference with the rest of its body, though, since it was in its shell. Is something wrong with it? I asked Ricky, who was looking annoyed. The camper boy gave a strained and obviously fake smile as he answered, no. Nothing's wrong. He always starts like this. He just likes that position, that's all. Oh, okay, I spoke, unsure if what Ricky was saying was true or not. Bulbasaur. Use poison gas while it's stuck in there. Bulbasaur's bulb shuddered before it unleashed a cloud dark purple gas from within. The poisonous cloud surrounded the Squirtle, and in seconds, it was beginning to cough. Now use Vine Whip to toss it around. Bulbasaur's vines shot out from beneath his bulbs and wrapped around the Squirtle, only for him to cry out in pain and retract them a bit. What's wrong? Heh. Be careful. My Squirtle's got spines on its shell that make it difficult to touch. Cool. Huh. Ricky boasted. Now, Squirtle, use Bubble Beam. But Squirtle did nothing. Oh, come on. Squirtle, I know you can hear me. Try and wrap it once again with yours vines, Bulbasaur. But be careful when trying to pick it up, I instructed him. Bulbasaur nodded and began to carefully wrap his vines around the Squirtle's shell, whining slightly, but not letting go. Now, toss it up into the air. Bulbasaur gave several grunts of effort and attempted to lift the Squirtle up, but he didn't seem to be able to. The most he could do was pull it closer towards him a bit. What's wrong? Heck yeah, my Squirtle's really heavy. It's about as hard as picking up a golem. I doubted that, but it was odd that it was so heavy. A Squirtle wasn't exactly in the same weight category as a golem or a Snorlax. Before I could ponder for much longer, a pair of blue arms and legs and a head popped out of the Squirtle's shell. While on all fours, it propelled itself towards Bulbasaur with its head lowered and rammed into his head. The force of the attack was enough to send Bulbasaur flying back into me, making me fall back just as I caught him. He gave a dazed groan, suggesting he was semi-conscious, but I knew he was in condition to battle. Bulbasaur, you did great, I said as I returned the grass type into his ball. I looked down at Pikachu. All right, Pikachu. It's your turn. The electric mouse smirked and confidently strode in front of me, and called out to the Squirtle as he began charging electricity in his cheeks. All right, Squirtle, you beat a grass type, and now you can beat an electric type. Ricky exclaimed. Just listen to me and we'll win this fight. His Squirtle snorted and slowly stood up on its hind legs. Now, use Bubble Beam to obscure its vision. Instead, It withdrew into its shell, landing on the ground with a heavy-sounding thud. Ricky's response was to groan. Pikachu, use Thunder Wave to paralyze it. Electricity crackled around Pikachu before it was fired at the Squirtle. Unable to dodge the jolt of electricity, the Squirtle was paralyzed. Now use Thunder Shock. A jolt of electricity was fired at the Squirtle. Miraculously, that seemed to be enough to make the water type cry out in pain. We all waited for the Squirtle to attack, whether on its own accord or by its trainer's command. But nothing happened. With a sigh, Ricky returned his Squirtle to its ball. Never mind. I forfeit, the camper boy muttered as he shoved Squirtle's ball back into his pants pocket. He walked up to me and held out a hand. That was a really good battle. You should go and challenge the gym in Vermilion City. Thank you. And I'm going too. I spoke quietly. Wow. I bet you've already got a bunch of badges already. Then it'd be no wonder that I couldn't win. I dunno, that Squirtle might have been a threat if wasn't so disobedient. Well, see ya. Ricky turned and ran down the road. After healing up Pikachu and Bulbasaur, I decided to do the same. XXX. I refused battles with any of the other trainers we came across as I ran down the dirt road with Pikachu, only stopping to catch my breath. It would have been faster to run through the wild grass alongside of the river, but I couldn't risk literally running into Pokémon and potentially wasting lots more time than simply sticking to the road would cause. It would have been even faster if I had a bike, but the one bike shop I'd seen had been in Cerulean City, and the price of their cheapest bike was far more money than I could splurge on a bike. While lamenting both my lack of a bike and the smallness of my funds, I crouched down by a spot by the riverside, barren of tall grass that wild Pokémon could jump out from. I released Horsey into the water, remembering my promise to let him swim whenever I could, and kept an eye on him as I drank from my small bottle of water. On the other side of the river, I saw that scout boy, Ricky, send out his Squirtle, which was still tucked into its shell. Well, I tried. I really tried. I felt bad for you when I found you drowning in the sea by Vermilion City. I heard you caused lots of trouble. I thought what you needed was a friend, but, obviously, you don't want to be friends with me, Ricky spoke sadly to the withdrawn Pokémon. There's no point in training a Pokémon that refuses to listen. So, goodbye, Squirtle. I'm setting you free. The boy held down the button on the front of his Pokeball, and in a few seconds, a beam of blue light hit the Squirtle, signifying that it had been released. Ricky then turned around and quickly walked off in the direction I had been going. That's sad, I spoke out loud. That Squirtle was an awful lot like Pikachu, I guess. Maybe if Ricky had stuck with it, he could have gotten closer to his Pokémon. I found myself staring at its shell long enough to be struck with an urge to catch it for myself. Whether it was a desire to give the turtle Pokémon a home and friends or a desire to complete my trio of starter Pokémon that fueled that urge, I didn't know, but I wanted to catch it. You know what? We can take a while to go and catch that Squirtle, can't we? Pikachu made a disgruntled sound while Horsey, not knowing what sort of personality Squirtle had, could only sound confused. Don't act like that. You and I didn't get along at first, but we're friends now, right? The electric mouse huffed and looked away. Anyway, it's an interesting Squirtle. If I caught it, it might help Professor Oak with his research or something. Pikachu snorted and muttered something that was probably derisive. I took out an empty Pokeball. How about this? If I throw a Pokeball, manage to hit the Squirtle with it, and it stays inside, that means I was meant to catch it. I remained crouching as I took aim, bringing thoughts of baseball players preparing for a pitch. I threw the Pokeball at the withdrawn Squirtle, but it wound up falling into the river, startling Horsey. I heard Pikachu laugh beside me while Horsey looked upset about me almost hitting him. One more try. I took out another empty Pokeball, stood up, and threw the ball. It wound up going over the Squirtle and fell into some bushes, causing something within to cry out. At that moment, a Psyduck walked out of the bushes holding its head. Its eyes, usually vacant, were glowing bright red and were narrowed in anger, probably because of the comically large bump on its head. The Psyduck spotted Squirtle and approached him, the grass spreading apart as the duck Pokémon walked. It spoke to Squirtle while pointing up at the bump at its head. Still within its shell, the Squirtle released a spray of foam into the Psyduck's face. I heard Squirtle's laugh echo out from inside of its shell before it was pushed by some unseen force into the river. The Psyduck laughed maliciously for a few seconds before its eyes suddenly stopped glowing and it regained its vacant look. It looked about in confusion, winced as it touched its bump, and waddled back into the bushes that it came from. "Well, that just happened," I stated casually, although I was a bit disturbed at seeing a Psyduck's abilities in person. Horsey looked down at the spot in the river where Squirtle had been dropped, where bubbles were floating up to the surface. He dived beneath the water for a few seconds before coming up, crying out in toots as he looked between me and the bubbling spot. Pikachu, who understood what Horsey was saying, began to point at the bubbling spot while he looked up at me. Both had looks of concern in their eyes. "Is Squirtle not okay?" I asked, not sure what they meant. Then again, it was attacked by some psychokinetic force, so of course it wasn't okay, but it was a water type, right? Shouldn't it have been able to swim on up to the surface if it wanted air? I leaned forward to look into the river. Luckily for me, it was crystal clear and let me see the Squirtle, now on its back, flailing its limbs wildly as bubbles rose up from its mouth to the surface. So it wasn't injured, just stuck. Poor Squirtle. "This is all my fault." Pikachu made a noise that sounded like he agreed with me. "But he's so heavy. If Bulbasaur couldn't lift him up, I doubt I could." An idea then came to my mind. That might work. Pikachu and Horsey could only stare in confusion as I pulled out the super rod from my bag. If I was able to get Squirtle to grab the lure, I might be able to slowly reel it in. I lowered the line into the water a few times, trying to guide the lure close enough to Squirtle for it to grab on. After ignoring the lure the first few times, Squirtle finally grabbed hold of it and I began to reel it in, and could I tell from the get-go how heavy that little turtle was. Pikachu eventually joined in the grunting, suggesting that he was helping to pull Squirtle up as well. Horsey. "Try to make a twister, like at the Cerulean Gym." I spoke as I continued to try and reel in the Squirtle. "Maybe Horsey could lift it up just enough for us to fish it out of the river." Horsey nodded, moved on top of the spot where the line had been, closed his eyes in concentration, and began to glow bright blue. A small whirlpool formed around Horsey before gradually becoming a twister of water. It worked a little too well, though. Rather than slowly lifting Squirtle up, the twister's strength shot him up to the surface and pulled along my super rod for the ride. When the twister dispersed, both Squirtle and the rod fell down from the sky, and landed right next to me. I stood there in shock of how close I'd been to getting hit by that Pokémon, especially when I realized how heavy it sounded upon landing. I suddenly remembered what I had been trying to do. I looked at the semi-conscious Squirtle lying face down in the grass and grabbed a Pokeball from my bag. Thinking that it wasn't going to struggle, I threw the ball down at it, only for the Squirtle to open its eyes and spray a burst of water with enough force to send the Pokeball flying back and into my face. I promptly fell over, my hand reaching up to cover my eye. I heard Pikachu shouting at what I assumed was the Squirtle. When I looked up, the water type was running away on all fours. It wasn't moving quickly, but I didn't feel compelled to catch it anymore. XXX. We were able to make it to Vermilion City by the afternoon. By that point, the pain of the black eye I got from that Pokeball had dulled a bit, though it still stung occasionally. Pikachu kept giving me looks that said he thought I deserved it, and maybe I did. I saw how that Squirtle acted with Ricky, but intrigue made me want to make it my own. I supposed that was a lesson to go after something I could control. Instead of focusing on the Squirtle that got away, I would focus on Charmander. According to the ticket Bill had given me, Tomorrow was the last day the SS. Anne would be docked at the Vermilion Harbor, and it would be setting sail at sunset. For putting up with whatever the professor put him through for the sake of research, the least I could do was give him the gift of being on a cruise ship, maybe even seeing one of those famous Vermilion City sunsets like they showed in pictures and on TV. So I went to the Pokemon Center, ignoring the nurse's questions when he asked about my eye, and went to call the professor while my Pokemon were being healed. But I was surprised to hear the voice that picked up on the other end. Hello. Good afternoon. This is Professor Oak's laboratory. He's not in right now, but I could take a message if you'd like. Daisy. No doubt about it. That was Blue's older sister Daisy on the other end of the line. It's Red. Oh. Red. How are you doing? I haven't seen you in days. I'm fine. And your little rivalry with Blue. How's your challenging the Pokemon League going? I got my second badge yesterday. That's great. Blue was just telling me earlier today that he got his fourth badge. I dropped the phone in shock. Fourth. He managed to get 2 more badges while I trailed behind him by just a day. No, it couldn't be true, but what reason would Blue have to lie to his own sister? I soon remembered what I was doing and picked up the phone. Sorry. Phone slipped. I'm glad he's doing so well. I lied, and Daisy was none the wiser. Well, I am too, but I don't want him getting too cocky. They say there's always gonna be at least one person who's better than you. I just want Blue to know it's okay if he isn't the best. Otherwise, he's gonna wind up like, what am I doing, gabbing your ear off like this? As much as I wanted to know who Daisy was talking about, I left the matter alone. I told her about how I transferred Charmander to the professor for him to research and asked if she could ask the aides if it was okay for him to be returned to me. Minutes later, she confirmed that Charmander had been transferred back to my PC account. Thanks a lot, Daisy. It was nice talking to you. You, too. Remember to call your mother. Oh, and look out for Blue for me. Bye. I hung up the phone and felt a bit bitter about her words. Blue already had 4 badges saying he was a better trainer than me. Why did I have to look out for him? Shoving my feelings of inadequacy down and regaining my calm, I left to go and withdraw Charmander. XXX. Charmander's reunion with our team was a happy one. Charmander didn't seem upset about my sending him off to Professor Oak, and I saw no signs that he'd been tearing off his scales, so I guess he was treated nicely while the professor was researching him. Pikachu was glad that he was back and spoke animatedly to him, which made me glad. Horsey seemed to like him from the moment they were introduced, and he seemed fascinated with the flame on Charmander's tail, at least until he got burned by it. Bulbasaur, though, freaked out a bit at the sight of Charmander's flame and attacked, starting a bit of a fight. Luckily, no fire or poison was used, and I only endured a few scratches and whiplashes as I calmed them down. Now they were both wary of each other and I felt it would take a while for them to get along. In an attempt to foster some sort of familiarity, I thought we could go to the seaside and see one of those picturesque Vermilion City sunsets that commercials on TV were so fond of saying. To make the bonding go more smoothly, I kept Charmander and Bulbasaur out of their balls. I even kept Horsey out and carefully placed him inside of my bag, just so he wouldn't feel left out. The walk to the harbor was peaceful until I heard a noise like thunder, followed by a flash of light I saw from the corner of my eye. I couldn't help being curious, so I wandered in the direction of the flashing light. As I got closer, I heard a voice shouting. Eventually, I was able to see the source. It was a policewoman, slouched over and looking exhausted. On the ground in front of her was that Squirtle from before. It stood proudly and laughed as it pointed at her. With a roar of frustration, she threw a Pokeball at the Squirtle. It turned around and knocked the ball back with its tail, which seemed to shine for a brief moment. The ball hit the officer in a way similar to how I'd been hit not too long ago. You little troublemaker. If I had any electric-type Pokemon, I'd zap you good. The Squirtle stuck its tongue out at her, making her shout some obscene curses that I probably shouldn't have heard. Was she trying to capture it? Maybe I should help. Pikachu, use Thunder Shock on it. Pikachu winked and sounded delighted to attack the Squirtle. He ran forward, charging up electricity, and zapped the water type with a jolt strong enough to knock it out. The Squirtle fell forward, unconscious. Pikachu looked pleased with his work. Wow. Thanks, kid. You have no idea how much easier this makes my job. The policewoman exclaimed as I came towards her with my Pokémon. I'd have dealt with that Squirtle myself, but he knocked out my Machop before he could be hit with any of her fighting-type moves. Fighting-type moves. The officer gave the unconscious Squirtle a bitter look as she sighed. I gave this Squirtle to some kid a few days ago. I thought that just because he had 3 gym badges, he could handle this thing, but if it's back here causing trouble, I guess he wasn't up to the task. This Squirtle's been causing trouble? I asked, wondering what it had done. It's been attacking the local Pokemon gym, which is part of my beat, so it's my responsibility. It's been doing so since it first appeared a couple of months ago. I think the gym leader said its trainer abandoned it after he lost his challenge against the gym. Then it disappeared and I thought maybe it got its anger out of its system. But then it came back a while ago looking like this with an even bigger attitude problem. At first it was just harmless pranks, but now he's wrecking the gym's exterior every day. I don't even have any sympathy left for this Pokemon delinquent. At this rate, I'd give anything for him to just go away. I'll take it. Pikachu gave an upset cry and began what sounded like a rant, but I ignored him as I continued. I only have 2 badges, but I am a traveling trainer. And I've had disobedient Pokemon in the past, too, so I know how to handle them. Okay, maybe that last part was a lie. Getting along with Pikachu, Charmander and Bulbasaur was something that came along naturally. Maybe I could do the same with Squirtle. And if not, well, I could still give the poor woman a break and release him somewhere far from Vermilion City. You know what? Fine, kid. If you've got the Pokeballs, you can catch this thing for yourself. I don't care if you raise it to be an upstanding citizen or just stuff it into a PC box for the rest of its days. Just make sure I don't see that thing around here causing trouble again, ya hear me? The policewoman spoke sternly. I nodded stiffly. Then catch it before it wakes up. I did as she said and threw a Pokeball at Squirtle. It barely shook before clicking, officially catching the water type. The policewoman gave a sigh of relief before giving me a stern look. Now see here, kid. If that Squirtle comes around here again and destroys any more property, you're gonna be paying the damages. Understand? I nodded in silence. Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go get some ice. The policewoman walked away, holding a hand over the black ice Squirtle had given her. I picked up Squirtle's ball and smiled down at my Pokemon. Charmander and Bulbasaur looked interested, but Pikachu was glaring up at me with his arms folded across his chest. I put the Pokeball away and took a breath before leading the procession down to the harbor. We were able to see the sunset despite the detour on our trip. And I can certainly say that the hype about the sunsets here were true. I'm not sure how my Pokemon felt, but it certainly was a breathtaking sight for me. It reminded me a bit of home, although I don't think the sunsets looked quite as nice there. Still, I couldn't help feeling something stir within me at that thought. I wound up sitting there staring at the sunset, feeling odd and homesick at the sight of it until the sun finally went down. XXX. I usually only stayed out late when I was training my team. Most of the time, I would go to bed early so I could get up as early as possible to do what needed to be done. Although I wasn't planning on doing something like staying up until midnight, I had decided to look around for the Vermilion City gym. I at least knew it was in the same area that I had caught Squirtle, so I was fortunate there. Eventually, I found the gym. It was close to the water and had a good view of the beach and the boats in the harbor. Lights were on inside and I could see the shapes of people moving around from the windows. The thought of Blue having 4 gym badges popped up in my mind and made me clench a fist in mild frustration. I then looked at the sign next to the entrance. It said that the gym leader was someone called Lieutenant Surge, the Lightning American. I didn't care what an American was, though. I was more interested in seeing the time the gym opened and closed. According to the sign, it was going to be open for a few more hours. Perfect. I looked down at Pikachu and asked, "Are you up to challenging another gym so soon?" Pikachu looked confused at first, as if wondering why I wanted to go challenge the gym leader so soon after coming into town. But then he got a look of determination in his eyes and nodded. Not only did he not mind, he was raring to go. To be honest, it was probably a bit immature to just rush towards the gym to challenge the leader just because of what Daisy told me about Blue. But for the longest time, since we were kids, we've always competed against one another in some way or another. Most of the time, Blue would win, but I would come close by a margin. I didn't care if he'd become the champion before me, I could always beat him and take the title for myself if need be. What I cared about was trailing too far behind of my rival. Because when Blue left people behind, it was usually far behind, and my pride made me not want that. As I entered the building, gaining the attention of the trainers inside, I was already thinking of the future. I would get my 3rd gym badge tonight, go party on the SS. And tomorrow morning, get to Saffron City and win my 4th badge by tomorrow afternoon or night, then go to Celadon City for my 5th badge. If only it had been as easy as I had expected.